Benny Morris is an Israeli historian. He is a professor of history in the Middle East Studies Department of Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in the city of Beersheba, Israel. He is a key member of the group of Israeli historians known as the New Historians, a term Morris coined to describe himself and historians Avi Shleiman Ilan Pape. Morris's work on the Arab-Israeli conflict and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has won praise and criticism from both sides of the political divide. He is accused by some academics in Israel of only using Israeli and never Arab sources, creating an unbalanced picture. Regarding himself as a Zionist, he writes, "I embarked upon the research not out of ideological commitment or political interest. I simply wanted to know what happened." Biography. Morris was born on 8 December 1948 in Kibbutz Ein HaHosh, the son of Jewish immigrants from the United Kingdom. He was born to Yaakov Morris, an Israeli diplomat, historian, and poet, and Sadie Morris, a journalist. According to The New Yorker, Benny Morris grew up in the heart of a left-wing pioneering atmosphere. His parents moved to Jerusalem when Morris was a year old. In the wake of his father's diplomatic duties, the family spent 4 years in New York when Morris was 9, and another 2 years there when he was 15. Morris served in infantry, including in the paratroops, during 1967 to 1969. He was wounded in 1969 by an Egyptian shell at the Suez Canal, and was released from the army 4 months later. He completed his undergraduate studies in history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and received a doctorate in modern European history from the University of Cambridge. During the 2015-2016 academic year, Morris serves as the Goldman Visiting Israeli Professor in Georgetown University's Department of Government. He lives in Moshav Strigim and is married with 3 children. Journalism career. After graduation from the University of Cambridge, he returned to Jerusalem and worked as a correspondent for the Jerusalem Post for 12 years. In 1982, he covered the Lebanon War, and also served as a reservist, taking part in the siege of Beirut in a mortar unit. In 1986, he did reserve duty in the West Bank. In 1988, when his artillery unit was called up for reserve duty in Nablus, he refused to serve and spent 3 weeks in jail. While working at the Jerusalem Post in the 1980s, Morris began reading through Israeli government archives, at first looking at the history of the Palmach, then turning his attention to the origins of the 1948 Palestinian exodus. Mainstream Israeli historiography at the time explained the 1948 Palestinian exodus from their towns and villages as having been driven by fear, or by instructions from Arab leaders. Morris found evidence that there had been expulsions in some cases. Political views. Morris summarized his current political views of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Irish Times. There was no Zionist plan, or blanket policy of evicting the Arab population, or of ethnic cleansing, and the demonization of Israel is largely based on lies, much as the demonization of the Jews during the past 2,000 years has been based on lies. And there is a connection between the two. Critics allege that Morris's first book is biased. Morris believes they failed to read his book with moral detachment, assuming that when he described Israeli actions as cruel or as atrocities, he was condemning them. In fact, he supports Israeli actions during 1948 such as the uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians. In a 2004 interview in Haaretz with Ari Shavot, he stated, "A Jewish state would not have come into being without the uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians. Therefore it was necessary to uproot them. There was no choice but to expel that population. It was necessary to cleanse the hinterland and cleanse the border areas and cleanse the main roads. It was necessary to cleanse the villages from which our convoys and our settlements were fired on." Morris also said that Israel was justified in uprooting the Palestinian Fifth Column after the Arabs attacked the infant state. and that proportion should be employed when considering the small war crimes committed by Israel in 1948. You have to put things in proportion. These are small war crimes. All told, if we take all the massacres and all the executions of 1948, we come to about 800 who were killed. In comparison to the massacres that were perpetrated in Bosnia, that's peanuts. In comparison to the massacres the Russians perpetrated against the Germans at Stalingrad, that's chicken feed. When you take into account that there was a bloody civil war here and that we lost an entire 1% of the population, you find that we behaved very well. His work has been criticized by Arab writers for failing to act on the evidence he found of forced evictions. In the Haaretz interview, he said, "There is no justification for acts of rape. There is no justification for acts of massacre. Those are war crimes. But in certain conditions, expulsion is not a war crime. I don't think that the expulsions of 1948 were war crimes." When Shaver called the 1948 Palestinian exodus ethnic cleansing, Morris responded, "Here are circumstances in history that justify ethnic cleansing. I know that this term is completely negative in the discourse of the 21st century. But where the choice is between ethnic cleansing and genocide, the annihilation of your people, I prefer ethnic cleansing." Morris criticized David Ben-Gurion for not carrying out such a plan, saying, "In the end, he faltered. If he had carried out a full expulsion, rather than a partial one, he would have stabilized the state of Israel for generations." His views changed in 2000 after the Palestinian rejection of President Clinton's peace accords and the beginning of the Second Intifada. "My turning point began after 2000. I wasn't a great optimist even before that. True, I always voted Labour or Meretz or Shelley, and in 1988 I refused to serve in the territories and was jailed for it. But I always doubted the intentions of the Palestinians. The events of Camp David and what followed in their wake turned the doubt into certainty. When the Palestinians rejected the proposal of Prime Minister Ehud Barak in July 2000 and the Clinton proposal in December 2000, I understood that they are unwilling to accept the two-state solution. They want it all." Lod and Acre and Jaffa. Morris still describes himself as left-wing because of his support for the two-state solution, but he believes his generation will not see peace in Israel. He has said, "I don't see the suicide bombings as isolated acts. They express the deep will of the Palestinian people. That is what the majority of the Palestinians want." On the subject of people the Palestinian Society sends to carry out the terrorist attacks, who he calls serial killers and barbarians who want to take our lives, Morris said, "The bombing of the buses and restaurants really shook me. They made me understand the depth of the hatred for us. They made me understand that the Palestinian, Arab and Muslim hostility toward Jewish existence here is taking us to the brink of destruction. Palestinian society is a very sick society. It should be treated the way we treat individuals who are serial killers. Maybe over the years the establishment of a Palestinian state will help in the healing process. But in the meantime, until the medicine is found, they have to be contained so that they will not succeed in murdering us. Something like a cage has to be built for them." I know that sounds terrible. It is really cruel. But there is no choice. There is a wild animal there that has to be locked up in one way or another. In the same Haaretz article, Morris called Israeli Arabs a time bomb. "If you are asking me whether I support the transfer and expulsion of the Arabs from the West Bank, Gaza and perhaps even from Galilee and the Triangle, I say not at this moment. I am not willing to be a partner to that act. In the present circumstances it is neither moral nor realistic. The world would not allow it. The Arab world would not allow it. It would destroy the Jewish society from within. If we find ourselves with atomic weapons around us, or if there is a general Arab attack on us in a situation of warfare on the front with Arabs in the rear shooting at convoys on their way to the front. Acts of expulsion will be entirely reasonable. They may even be essential. Their slide into complete Palestinization has made them an emissary of the enemy that is among us. They are a potential fifth column. In both demographic and security terms, they are liable to undermine the state, so that if Israel again finds itself in a situation of existential threat, as in 1948, it may be forced to act as it did then. If we are attacked by Egypt and by Syria, and chemical and biological missiles slam into our cities, and at the same time Israeli Palestinians attack us from behind, I can see an expulsion situation. It could happen. If the threat to Israel is existential, expulsion will be justified. Morris called the Israel-Palestinian conflict a facet of a global clash of civilizations between Islamic fundamentalism and the Western world in the Haaretz interview, saying, "There is a deep problem in Islam. It's a world whose values are different. A world in which human life doesn't have the same value as it does in the West, in which freedom, democracy, openness and creativity are alien. Revenge plays a central part in the Arab tribal culture. Therefore, the people we are fighting and the society that sends them have no moral inhibitions." He sees the Jews as the greater victims. A people that suffered for 2,000 years, that went through the Holocaust, arrives at its patrimony but is thrust into a renewed round of bloodshed. That is perhaps the road to annihilation. In terms of cosmic justice, that's terrible. It's far more shocking than what happened in 1948 to a small part of the Arab nation that was then in Palestine. We are the greater victims in the course of history, and we are also the greater potential victim. Even though we are oppressing the Palestinians, we are the weaker side here. We are a small minority in a large sea of hostile Arabs who want to eliminate us. So it's possible then, when the desire is realized, everyone will understand what I am saying to you now. Everyone will understand we are the true victims. But by then it will be too late. In an op-ed piece in the New York Times in July 2008, Morris wrote, "Iran's leaders would do well to rethink their gamble and suspend their nuclear program. Bar this, the best they could hope for is that Israel's conventional air assault will destroy their nuclear facilities. To be sure, this would mean thousands of Iranian casualties and international humiliation. But the alternative isn't Iran turned into a nuclear wasteland." In an interview with the Austrian newspaper Der Standard, Morris argues for a preemptive nuclear strike on Iran as the only alternative left to stop the Iranian nuclear program. Criticisms of Morris's post-2000 views. Commenting on the post-2000 reversal of position by Morris, Shlomo Ben-Ami, former Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, wrote that Morris's more recent thesis about the birth of the Palestine refugee problem being not by design but by the natural logic and evolution of war is not always sustained by the very evidence he himself provides. Cultured officers had turned into base murderers, and this not in the heat of battle, but out of a system of expulsion and destruction. The less Arabs remained, the better. This principle is the political motor for the expulsions and atrocities. Quoting from Morris's major 2004 work, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, Finkelstein describes this enigma as, thus, as already mentioned, the scholarly consensus is that Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. Israel's leading historian on the topic, Benny Morris, although having done more than anyone else to clarify exactly what happened, nonetheless concludes that, morally, it was a good thing, just as, in his view, the annihilation of Native Americans was a good thing, that, legally, Palestinians have no right to return to their homes, and that, politically, Israel's big error in 1948 was that it hadn't carried out a large expulsion and cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel, as far as the Jordan, of Palestinians. Israeli historian Avi Shlaim expands on Morris's conversion His 1988 book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947–1949, drove a coach and horses through the claim that the Palestinians left Palestine of their own accord or on orders from their leaders. With a great wealth of recently declassified material, he analyzed the role that Israel played in precipitating the Palestinian exodus. The hallmark of his approach was to stick as closely as possible to the documentary evidence, to record rather than to evaluate. While his findings were original and arresting, he upheld the highest standards of historical scholarship, and he wrote with almost clinical detachment. The message, pithily summed up in a long interview that Benny gave to Yediot Aharonot about his highly publicized conversion, is that the Arabs are responsible. Where no evidence is available to sustain the argument of Arab intransigence, Benny makes it up by drawing on his fertile imagination. His post-conversion interpretation of history is old history with a vengeance. It is indistinguishable from the propaganda of the victors. Ari Shavit, senior correspondent at Haaretz, commented on Morris's justification for the expulsion of the Arabs in 1948 by contrasting citizen Morris with historian Morris, and noting that, at times, citizen Morris and historian Morris worked as though there is no connection between them, as though one was trying to save what the other insists on eradicating. Selected book summaries. The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947–1949. In his first The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947–1949, Morris argues that the 700,000 Palestinians who fled their homes in 1947 left mostly due to Israeli military attacks, fear of impending attacks, and expulsions. He argues that there was no centralized expulsion policy as such, but expulsions were ordered by the Israeli High Command as needed. This was a controversial position when Morris first wrote of it. The official position in Israel was that the Palestinians had left voluntarily, or under pressure from Palestinian or other Arab leaders. At the same time, Morris documents atrocities by the Israelis, including cases of rape and torture. The book shows a map of 228 empty Palestinian villages, and attempts to explain why the villages left. In 41 villages, he writes, the inhabitants were expelled by the IDF. In another 90, residents fled because of attacks on other villages, and in 6, they left under instructions from local Palestinian authorities. He was unable to find out why another 46 villages were abandoned. The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited. In his updated The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, Morris answers critics of the first version and adds material from the opening of new Israeli government archives. He writes that the contents of the new documents substantially increase both Israeli and Palestinian responsibility for the refugee problem, revealing more expulsions and atrocities on the Israeli side, and more orders from Arab officials to the Palestinians to leave their villages, or at least to send their women and children away. Morris writes that his conclusions are unlikely to please either Israeli or Palestinian propagandists, or black or white historians. 1948 and after 1948 and after. Israel and the Palestinians is a collection of essays dedicated to the Palestinian exodus of 1948 and subsequent events. It analyses MAPI and MAPM policy during the exodus, the IDF report of July 1948 on its causes, Joseph Weitz's involvement in the events, and some cases of expulsions that occurred in the 50s. Although Morris dismisses the claim that the Palestinians were systematically expelled due to orders from Israeli officials, he nevertheless cites an IDF intelligence report that concludes that 70% of the exodus was caused by Israeli forces and Jewish dissidents. The IDF report lists the factors that precipitated the exodus in order of importance: direct, hostile Jewish, Haganah, IDF, operations against Arab settlements, The effective Haganah IDF hostile operations on nearby Arab settlements. Operations of the Jewish dissidents, the Irguns of Arelumi and Lohami Hirat Yisrael. Collectively these three factors were considered to be responsible for causing 70% of the exodus, according to the IDF report. Furthermore, Morris states, the report makes no mention of any blanket order issued over Arab radio stations or through other means to the Palestinians to evacuate their homes and villages, despite, as Morris states, the IDF monitoring Arab radio transmissions. Righteous victims, a history of the Zionist-Arab conflict, 1881 to 2001, is based largely on secondary works and gives a synthesis of existing research on the various subjects and periods covered. Morris writes, a history of this subject, based mainly on primary sources, is, I suspect, beyond the abilities of a single scholar. There are simply too many archives, files, and documents. Nonetheless, parts of the present book, the coverage of the 1948 war and the decade after it, and of certain episodes that occurred during the 1930s and the 1982–85 Lebanon War, are based in large measure on primary sources, making Israel. Edited by Morris. This collection of articles was written by traditionalists and revisionists who openly and directly lay out their key insights about Israel's origins. The articles can be downloaded from the website of the University of Michigan Press. 1948. A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. Morris gives a detailed account of the 1948 Palestine War. Yoav Gelber writes, 1948 is a praiseworthy achievement of research and analysis, the work of a historian unwilling to rest on his already considerable laurels. Gelber disagrees with some of Morris's analysis, in particular with the idea that the 1948 war was more a clash of civilizations between the West and Islam than a nationalist struggle. He also argues that Morris overestimates Israel's military strength, and disagrees with Morris about the aims of King Abdullah of Jordan. One state, two states. Morris contends that there is no two-state solution to the Middle East crisis, and that the one-state solution is not viable because of Arab unwillingness to accept a Jewish national presence in the Middle East. He suggests the possibility of something like a three-state solution in the form of a Palestinian confederation with Jordan,